The train driver's hand was still gripping the dead man's handle, still applying the exact pressure required to keep the train moving. His eyes were open, looking straight ahead through the windscreen. The brakes, untouched. The emergency stop, ignored. The platform had ended 66 feet ago. The sand drag designed to stop coasting trains had already failed, and ahead, 20 feet of overrun tunnel ending in solid Victorian brick. Leslie Newson's hand never moved. The Northern Line train, carrying 295 morning commuters, accelerated into the wall at 40 miles per hour. The first car compressed from 54 feet to 21 feet. In less than 1 second. 43 people died in the darkness, 174 were injured, and the rescue would take 5 days of cutting through twisted metal and crushed bodies in a tunnel too small to stand in. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. Every safety system designed to prevent this, every backup, every failsafe, they were all functioning perfectly. The dead man's handle, working as designed. The driver, medically sound, no drugs, no alcohol, no heart attack, no stroke, no explanation. Which meant British Rail's worst nightmare had just been confirmed. Their entire safety philosophy assumed drivers would either stay conscious or let go. They never imagined a third option. A driver who stays awake, keeps his hand on the controls, and drives deliberately into a wall for reasons nobody will ever understand. This is the story of the Moorgate tube crash. The story of how British Rail's faith in human operators, their conviction that trained professionals would never fail catastrophically, collapsed in a tunnel under the City of London on February 28, 1975. It's a story of a safety system that couldn't account for the incomprehensible. Of warnings that came too late, of rescue workers who pulled bodies from metal coffins. And of how 43 deaths forced the realization that humans can't be trusted with trains. Not because they're incompetent, but because sometimes, for reasons beyond understanding, they just don't stop. Moorgate Station sits in the financial district of London, just north of the Bank of England, in the heart of the city. In 1975, it was a busy commuter hub, serving the Northern Line's terminus. The word terminus is important. Unlike through stations where trains enter one side and exit the other, terminus stations have dead ends. Trains arrive, discharge passengers, and reverse direction to go back the way they came. This requires specific track layouts. At Moorgate, the Northern Line platform had a single track that ended in an overrun tunnel. This overrun tunnel was a safety feature. It extended 66 feet beyond the platform, filled with sand drag, designed to stop trains that might coast past the platform. Beyond the sand drag, a brick wall. The tunnel was only needed if a train somehow failed to stop at the platform, which shouldn't happen, because drivers were trained, supervised, and backed up by the dead man's handle. The dead man's handle, also called a dead man's switch or vigilance control, was the primary safety system. It worked on a simple principle. The driver had to maintain constant pressure on a handle or button. If they let go, if they collapsed, if they lost consciousness, the handle would release. And the train would automatically apply full emergency braking. It was elegant, foolproof, based on the assumption that an incapacitated driver would relax their grip. What it couldn't account for, what nobody had ever considered, was a driver who maintained pressure while something else went catastrophically wrong in their mind. Leslie Newson was 56 years old. He'd worked for London Transport since 1950, 25 years of service. Started as a motorman on the Metropolitan line, transferred to the Northern Line in 1969. By 1975, he was an experienced driver with an unblemished record, known for being careful, methodical, reliable. His colleagues described him as quiet, competent, someone who followed procedures. His family life was stable, married to Margaret Newson for 31 years, 2 grown daughters, a mortgaged house in Newbury Park. He had no financial troubles, no marital problems, no known health issues. The morning of February 28 started like any other. Newson reported for duty at Drayton Park Depot, took control of train number 172, a 6-car formation of 1938 tube stock. Old trains, but well maintained, due for replacement but perfectly serviceable. His first runs were normal, nothing unusual reported, no mechanical issues, no concerns from passengers or staff. By 8:39 a.m., he'd completed multiple round trips on the Northern Line. His final journey would be southbound, from Drayton Park to Moorgate. The train left Drayton Park on schedule, moved through the Northern Line stations, Old Street, then approaching Moorgate. Passengers in the carriages were the usual morning crowd. City workers heading to offices, secretaries, clerks, bankers, accountants. Reading newspapers, standing in that particular London commuter stance, swaying with the train's movement, minds already on their workday ahead. In the driver's cab, Leslie Newson sat at the controls. What he was thinking, what he was experiencing, nobody will ever know. But what happened next was witnessed by multiple people. And their testimony would haunt investigators for decades. Robert Harris was waiting on the Moorgate platform. A regular commuter, he stood near the front, wanting to be first on so he could get a seat. He watched the train emerge from the tunnel, moving at normal approach speed. Quote, "I expected it to slow down, that's what they always do. You hear the brakes, feel the train decelerating, but this one, it didn't slow. I remember thinking that's odd, then thinking maybe I was wrong about the speed, then realizing no, something's wrong, and then it just kept going, past the platform, into the tunnel, and I heard this sound I'll never forget, metal tearing, screaming, both kinds of screaming, the metal and the people." Harris ran toward the platform edge, peered into the tunnel. Darkness, dust, silence for a moment, then moaning, crying, voices calling for help. Paul Wilkinson was a station supervisor. He was on the platform when the train passed. Quote, "I saw the driver's cab, clear as day. He was sitting normally, not slumped, not collapsed, just sitting, looking forward, both hands on the controls. I thought for a second he must know something I don't, like he's authorized to go into the depot tunnel. But then I remembered, we don't have a depot tunnel. There's nothing beyond the platform. Except." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Underground motorman James Stratford was operating a train on the adjacent platform. He watched Newson's train pass. Quote, "I expected him to brake. Every driver brakes at Moorgate. You have to. It's the terminus. But his train it kept going. I saw his face, his profile. He looked normal, not distressed, not panicked, just looking ahead, like he was driving to the next station, except there wasn't a next station. I knew immediately something catastrophic had happened, but I couldn't process what. because it didn't make sense. Still doesn't. The train entered the overrun tunnel at approximately 35 to 40 miles per hour. The sand drag, designed to stop a slowly coasting train, was useless against deliberate acceleration. The train barely slowed. 66 feet into the overrun tunnel, 900 tons of steel and humanity impacted the solid brick wall. The physics were straightforward. An object in motion, meeting an immovable barrier, the kinetic energy had to go somewhere. It went into crushing the train. The first car, where Leslie Newson sat, bore the full force. The car telescoped, the front compressed back into itself, metal folding like aluminum foil, but with devastating force. The second car, driven forward by the momentum of the cars behind it, climbed up over the first, creating a scissors effect, metal shearing, rivets popping, bodies crushed between collapsing steel. The third car jackknifed, derailing, slamming into the tunnel walls. The fourth, fifth, sixth cars concertinaed, each plowing into the one ahead. The tunnel was only 11 feet wide. The compressed wreckage filled it completely, from floor to ceiling, wall to wall. And inside, trapped in pockets of twisted metal, were passengers. Some were dead instantly, killed by the impact, by crushing trauma, by metal fragments. Others were alive, trapped, injured, calling for help in the darkness. The sound was described by survivors as inhuman. The tearing of metal, the compression of carriages, the screams, the sudden awful silence, then moaning, crying, people calling names. Looking for loved ones, looking for way out, realizing they were trapped. Stephen Jones was in the third car. He survived, but barely. His testimony to the inquiry painted a picture of hell. Quote, "The lights went out, obviously, power cuts in a crash, so it was dark, but not completely, there was sparks, electrical fires starting, and in that flickering light, I could see, the car ahead had climbed up, the ceiling was where the floor should be, people were, I'm sorry, people were crushed. The metal had just compressed, and the screaming was, and then it stopped, and the silence was worse, because you knew why it stopped." He paused in his testimony, composed himself, continued. "I was trapped by the legs, pinned by a seat that had broken loose. I could move my upper body, but I couldn't get free, and around me, people calling for help, people injured, people dead, just dead, right there, and you couldn't help them, couldn't reach them, couldn't do anything but wait in the dark and hope someone was coming. On the platform, chaos. Passengers who hadn't boarded, station staff, all standing in shock. Robert Harris, the man who'd watched the train disappear, later told reporters, quote, "Nobody moved for, I don't know, seconds. It felt like minutes. We just stood there, processing what we'd seen. Then everyone started moving at once, running to the tunnel entrance, shouting. Someone pulled the emergency alarm. Someone else was trying to find a phone. And I remember thinking this can't be happening. This doesn't happen. Trains they don't crash at stations. They have safety systems. They have drivers who know what they're doing. And yet." The emergency call reached London Fire Brigade at 8:46 a.m. 7 minutes after impact. Initial reports were confused. A train crash at Moorgate. Casualties unknown. Request immediate assistance. Station officer Randolph Stride of Barbican Fire Station was first to receive the call. His crew responded within minutes, driving through the city's morning traffic, not knowing what they were heading toward. When they arrived at Moorgate Station, they were met by station staff, pale, shaking, trying to explain what had happened. A train, driven into the overrun tunnel, crashed into the wall. Casualties? They didn't know. Many. Definitely many. Stride descended to the platform, looked into the tunnel. Later, at the inquiry, he described what he saw. Quote, "Darkness, obviously, the power was off. We had our torches, and in those beams of light, I could see wreckage, compressed metal. The train it wasn't a train anymore. It was compacted. That's the word. Compacted. Like someone had taken 6 cars and crushed them into 3 cars worth of space. And you could hear people trapped inside, calling, moaning." He made an immediate assessment. This was beyond anything he'd trained for. This would require every resource London Fire Brigade could muster. By 9 a.m., emergency services were arriving en masse. Fire crews from across London, ambulances lining the streets, police establishing cordons. The roads around Moorgate were closed, emergency vehicles filled Moorfields, a small street running behind the main station entrance. And as more fire officers descended into the tunnel and assessed the wreckage, the true horror became clear. This wasn't a rescue operation. This was a recovery operation. With a small, desperate chance that some trapped passengers might still be saved. Steve Gleason was part of Lambeth Blue Watch that day. He arrived within the first hour, carrying spreading and cutting gear down to platform level. Quote, "We were immediately told to get our spreading and cutting gear and take it down to the platform level. As we were taking our gear down, firefighters were guiding casualties, covered in dust and grime, up the other escalators to safety, as well as to grab more equipment. You could see it in their eyes, the ones coming up. They'd seen something bad." The rescue would eventually involve 1,324 firefighters, 240 police officers, 80 ambulance workers, 16 doctors, and countless volunteers, all working in conditions that defied description. If you're learning about institutional failures that shaped modern safety systems, subscribing helps preserve these critical histories. The tunnel was a nightmare to work in. Only 11 feet wide, the train wreckage filled it completely, leaving barely enough space to move. Firefighters had to crawl, dragging equipment through spaces barely wider than their bodies. The temperature soared, compressed metal, electrical fires, no ventilation. Officers working in the confined space faced temperatures approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Some reports said temperatures exceeded 105 degrees. When cutting equipment was used, when oxyacetylene torches began slicing through metal, the temperature climbed even higher. The oxygen depleted rapidly. Workers were limited to 20-minute shifts underground, followed by 40 minutes rest on the surface. Firefighter Brian Goodfellow worked one of the early shifts. Quote, "I managed to pull out at least 16 badly injured commuters, but there are some poor devils down there we can't do much for. Their bodies had been forced down in among the wheels, the metal, the machinery. You couldn't tell where the train ended and they began." He paused, composed himself. Quote continued. "Survivors came out looking literally as though they had been pulled through a sack of soot. Black, completely black, eyes wide. Some of them didn't know they were hurt. Shock. One man kept asking about his briefcase. His leg was clearly broken, but he wanted his briefcase. The air was thick with dust, metal particles, insulation, the smell. Survivors who worked the rescue describe it decades later and still struggle. Blood, fuel, electrical burning, death. Station officer Jude McCourt, leading one of the cutting teams, later wrote in his memoirs, quote, "We had to crawl, there wasn't room to stand. We dragged cutting equipment through spaces barely wider than our bodies, and the metal, it wasn't just twisted, it was interlaced, folded over itself, compressed so tightly that cutting through it revealed things, revealed people, or what remained of them. I've been in the fire brigade 30 years, seen house fires, car crashes, industrial accidents. Nothing prepared me for this, nothing could." The rescue teams worked methodically. They had to. Cutting metal blindly could kill trapped survivors. Moving wreckage could cause collapses. Every action had to be calculated. They established that there were definitely survivors. Voices coming from deeper in the wreckage. People trapped but alive. The priority became reaching them. They cut, slowly, painstakingly. Using hydraulic spreaders, cutting torches, hacksaws when torches couldn't be used safely. Each piece of metal removed, carefully, passed back through the tunnel, hand to hand, a human chain removing debris. Medical teams were on standby. Dr. Arthur Wilson, a consultant at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, was called to the scene. He descended into the tunnel multiple times, treating survivors trapped in the wreckage, administering morphine, providing comfort. His account, published years later, described the medical challenges. Quote, "You're working in darkness, in heat, in spaces so confined you can't move freely. The patients are trapped by metal, sometimes impaled by it. You can't perform proper examinations, can't stabilize them properly. You're doing emergency medicine in conditions that would make a field hospital look luxurious, and you're making decisions. Do we cut them free now, even though moving them might kill them? Or do we wait, try to stabilize, risk them dying while we wait? There are no good options. Just, least worst options." 19-year-old Margaret Lyles was trapped in the second car. Alive, conscious, but pinned by wreckage. Her left foot was crushed, tangled with another passenger, a stockbroker named Jeff Benton. Rescue workers could see her, could talk to her, but couldn't immediately reach her. The wreckage around them was unstable. Moving the wrong piece of metal could cause collapse, could kill them both. Fire officer Robert Hunt established communication. Quote, "She was incredibly brave. She could see what we were doing, could see other casualties around her, but she stayed calm, answered our questions, told us where she hurt. We told her we were coming, that we'd get her out, and she believed us. She trusted us." By 9 a.m., just 14 minutes after impact, all passengers from the third carriage had been evacuated. The speed of that initial rescue saved lives. Emergency services leaping into action, never hesitating, working with precision despite the horror. By 3:15 p.m. that afternoon, 7 hours after the crash, they'd removed all but 2 survivors from the second car. Margaret Lyles and Jeff Benton. Still trapped, still tangled together in the crushed metal. The decision was made. Margaret's foot would have to be amputated, there, in the darkness and heat, to free her. A surgeon was brought down into the tunnel. Anesthetic administered as best it could be. The amputation performed with cutting tools and surgical saws. It took 8 hours of cutting to position the surgical team. Margaret would later tell the press, quote, "My leg was completely numb. I only thought it was broken. I didn't realize, I didn't know they were going to have to, until afterward, when they told me, and by then, I just felt grateful, grateful to be alive, grateful to be out." When they finally extracted her, 13 hours trapped in the wreckage, she was alive. Rushed to St. Bartholomew's Hospital for emergency treatment. Jeff Benton was pulled free shortly after. But the compression, the hours of being crushed, the toxins building up in his trapped body. When he was finally released, when blood flow resumed, those toxins flooded his system. Crush syndrome. He died in hospital weeks later. One more victim, freed alive only to succumb to injuries that were invisible until it was too late. By 10 p.m. that evening, the last known survivor had been removed. The lead medical officer made a decision. He called for complete silence. Total silence in the tunnel, on the platform, throughout the station. And in that silence, he called out, over and over, for any survivors to make themselves known. Anyone still alive, anyone still conscious, call out, make a sound, anything. The silence that followed was devastating. They had not yet reached the first carriage, where the compression had been worst. And they all knew, that there would be no survivors there. But they called anyway, because hope, even impossible hope, had to be honored. Nothing. No voices, no tapping, no sound but the settling of metal and the heavy breathing of exhausted rescuers. She would survive, one of the lucky ones. But for every Margaret Lyles, there were others who weren't so fortunate. Station Officer Peter Heath was part of the team working deeper in the wreckage, where the first car had compressed. Quote, "We found the driver's cab, or what remained of it. The compression was catastrophic. The front of the train had been pushed back, metal folded, crushed, and inside, Leslie Newson, or what we could recover, the force had been, the impact had been." He couldn't continue. The interviewer waited. Quote continued. "His hand was still on the dead man's handle. We could see that, even with everything, his hand was still gripping it. That's what struck me. That's what I'll never forget. Because it meant he was conscious when he hit the wall. He was holding that handle, applying pressure, right up to the moment of impact." The recovery operation continued for 5 days. 5 days of cutting, extracting, identifying. Fire crews worked in shifts, descending into the tunnel for a few hours, emerging exhausted, traumatized, then going back. Ambulances waited on the streets above, ready to transport survivors. But as the hours passed, the survivors became fewer, the bodies more common. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the nearest major hospital to Moorgate, declared a major incident. Emergency doctors remained in the hospital to receive casualties. Non-emergency surgeons traveled to the scene. Student nurse Gilly Hewitson was pulled from the neurosurgical floor where she'd heard loads of ambulances going by. She was sent to Bowlby Ward, which had been emptied so casualties could be placed there. Quote, "I was kept busy for the rest of the day taking observations and washing them, as they were all covered in soot. There were many cuts and broken bones. The stories I heard that day from the survivors were chilling. One man told me he always sat in the first carriage. But that day, he was late, and had to get in one further back. He felt so lucky to be alive. Think about that. A man who was late, who broke his routine, who probably cursed his timing that morning, rushing for the train. His lateness saved his life. While the people who were on time, who followed their routines, who did everything right, they died. What's the logic in that? What's the fairness? Another nurse, Nikki Marks, was a junior staff member, the most junior on her ward. Quote, "It was a time which is very vivid in my memory. I felt separate from all the buzz of the VIP visitors. Prince Charles came to visit patients, but he never came to our ward. I remember that I felt close to the patients and the need to care for them. Some of them got upset by keep having to go over what happened. I could listen and get them a cup of tea. They initially put all the patients on one ward and then triaged them to various wards in the hospital. As a student nurse, I was involved in the basic nursing care. A lot of hands-on patient care. One patient haunted the nurses. A 19-year-old woman police constable, Margaret Lyles, who required daily dressing changes. The changes were too painful and traumatic to be undertaken on the ward. So she would be brought up to ICU for a light anesthetic and dressing change. Performed by her team, while nursing staff watched, helpless to ease her suffering beyond basic comfort. The final death toll was 43. 43 people who'd boarded a train that morning, thinking about their workday, about meetings and deadlines and lunch plans. Never imagining they had minutes to live. Lawrence Marks was a Sunday Times reporter. On the morning of February 28, he was working, following the news of the crash. It was only later in the day that he discovered his 68-year-old father might be a passenger. That evening, he made a call. A call repeated every hour, to the emergency switchboard set up by police for relatives of those trapped in the crash. Quote, "Every call ended with the same monotone, 'No. Sorry. No Bernard Marks on our lists. No. He hasn't been admitted to any of the hospitals. If we get any news, we will call you straight away. I didn't sleep that night. And my dad didn't come home.'" He paused, remembering. Quote continued. "I was turning over in my mind where he might be, knowing in my heart that my dad, a creature of habit, had not lost his memory, was not wandering the streets of London having been concussed. No. I just felt he was dead." At 11 a.m. the next day, the doorbell rang. A solemn-looking police constable stood there, asked if he might come in, and then asked Lawrence to sit down. Quote, "Before he had even spoken a word, a coldness ran through me, as though someone were dripping ice droplets through my bloodstream. He removed a piece of paper from his pocket and began to read, 'Your father, Bernard Marks, was removed from the wreckage of the train at Moorgate Station at 4:30 this morning. I am terribly sorry to tell you he is dead.' I sat in a state of shock. As he laid his hand on my shoulder, he, too, looked grief-stricken, as he told me I was the third person he had broken bad news to that morning." The police constable had delivered 3 death notifications by 11 a.m. And it was only Saturday. The recovery would continue for days. Mary, another family member, lost her husband. He was 26, she was 23, with a son named George. Decades later, she would write, quote, "My husband died on the train. He was 26, I was 23 with son called George. So sad for us and all people die in it. You can never forget him. He was lovely dad and husband to both of us." The grammatical errors, the simple language, make it somehow more heartbreaking. Raw grief that never fully processed, never fully healed. Robert Harris, the man who'd watched from the platform, later told the BBC, quote, "I could have been on that train, I usually am, but that morning I was running late, missed the previous train by seconds, so I was waiting, and I watched, and I think about that, I think about the people who were on time, who made their train, who did everything right, and they died, while I, a man who was late, I lived. What's the logic in that? What's the fairness?" Leslie Newson had been carrying £270 in his jacket that morning. Nearly £2,000 in today's money. He was planning to buy a second-hand car for his daughter after his shift ended. He joked with colleagues before starting, sharing his sugar for their tea, saying, "Go easy on it. I shall want another cup when I come off duty." He'd brought his work satchel, containing a bottle of milk, sugar, his rulebook, and a notebook. In that notebook, he documented ways London Underground could make improvements and enhancements to their services. This was a man who cared about his job, who thought about how to do it better, who planned for a future that included buying his daughter a car. Not a man who seemed suicidal, not a man who seemed depressed, not a man who seemed anything other than normal. The investigation began while rescue operations were still ongoing. The Ministry of Transport, British Rail, the police, all wanted answers. How had this happened? How had every safety system failed? And most urgently, could it happen again? On March 4, 4 days after the crash, they finally reached Leslie Newson's body. Gordon Hafter, London Underground's chief engineer, and Lieutenant Colonel Ian McNaughton, the chief inspecting officer of railways, examined the driver's cab. Normally 91 centimeters deep, it had been crushed to 15 centimeters. 6 inches. Hafter reported his examination to the subsequent inquiry. Quote, "His left hand was close to, but not actually on the driver's brake handle, and his right arm was hanging down to the right of the main controller. His head was to the left of the dead man's handle, which had been forced upwards, beyond its normal travel, and was resting on his right shoulder. His head had been forced through the front window. The removal of his body took hours. So much of the train was crushed around him. So much metal had to be carefully cut away. The post-mortem was conducted by Professor Keith Simpson, one of Britain's most eminent forensic pathologists. Home Office pathologist, respected, thorough. Lawrence Marks, Bernard Marks' son, would later meet with Simpson to understand what had happened to his father. But first, Simpson wanted to understand what had happened to the driver. He explained both what he had looked for, and what he had found. First, he'd wanted to rule out electrical injury, which would have provided an instant explanation for what had happened. But there had been no mark or electrical burn on the body that might have prevented Newson from controlling the speed of the train. The X-rays of Newson's hands and forearms confirmed something chilling. He had not raised his hands before impact. Even though it is a natural human instinct, a reflex, to protect your face when you see impact coming. His hands remained on the controls, or near them, right up until the moment of impact. The cause of death was listed as shock from multiple injuries. What otherwise appeared to be a perfectly healthy man. No dissolved drug or poison matter. Nothing to suggest a seizure or brain disease of any kind. No indication of a heavy drinking habit. The liver showed no signs of chronic alcohol consumption. But, and this is where controversy entered the investigation, there was an elevated blood alcohol level, estimated at up to 80 milligrams per 100 milliliters, the legal driving limit at the time. But, and this is critical, by the time they recovered Newson's body, 4 days had passed. 4 days in the heat, in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. The body had undergone significant decomposition. And decomposition produces alcohol. As bacteria break down tissues, they create ethanol. Forensic pathologists know this, they account for it. Simpson and other experts debated whether the alcohol level was real or artifact of decomposition. The consensus, debated but deemed non-contributory. There was simply no way to know for certain. And nothing else in Newson's life, his habits, his medical history, suggested he had been drinking that morning. His medical records were reviewed. No history of blackouts, no epilepsy, no cardiac issues, no neurological problems. His last medical examination, 6 months before, showed a healthy man. Slightly overweight, mild blood pressure elevation, nothing that would explain sudden incapacitation. His psychiatric history was examined. No depression, no suicidal ideation, no treatment for any mental health conditions. Investigators interviewed his family, his colleagues, his friends, looking for any indication of distress, financial problems, marital issues, anything that might suggest suicide. They found nothing. Margaret Newson, his wife, testified at the inquiry. Quote, Leslie was happy, or, he seemed happy, he liked his job, we had plans, we were saving for a holiday, our daughter was getting married in the summer, he was excited about that, there was nothing that would make anyone think he'd. She couldn't say the word suicide, because it didn't make sense. Men planning to kill themselves don't, generally, plan holidays, look forward to their daughter's wedding. His colleagues painted the same picture. Motorman David Fletcher, who'd worked with Newson for years, testified. Quote, Les was solid, that's the word, solid, reliable, he followed procedures, he was cautious, almost overly cautious. If anything, he was the type to brake too early, not too late. The idea that he'd deliberately drive into a wall, deliberately kill passengers, it's impossible. It goes against everything I knew about him. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The train had accelerated into the overrun tunnel. Leslie Newson's hand had been gripping the dead man's handle. His eyes had been open. He had been conscious, aware, and for reasons nobody could explain, he hadn't stopped. Dr. Arthur Connell, a neuropsychologist brought in as an expert witness, proposed a theory. Transient global amnesia. A rare condition where, without warning, a person loses the ability to form new memories. Blood supply is cut off to the temporal lobe. They remain conscious, can perform complex tasks, but have no awareness of context or situation. No ability to form new memories, no understanding of where they are or what they're doing. It was possible, Connell argued, that Newson experienced such an event. That he continued operating the train, hands on the controls, eyes open, but without any awareness that he was approaching a terminus. without any memory that Moorgate was the end of the line. Simply driving forward, as he'd done thousands of times before. Another possibility, akinesis with mutism. A brainstorm condition where you appear alert, conscious, aware. But you can't move, can't speak, can't react. The brain continues to function, the individual remains aware, but cannot physically respond. This would explain why Newson appeared to be looking straight ahead, calm, alert. But took no action, made no defensive gesture, didn't raise his hands. But to positively diagnose either condition, you'd need microscopic examination of brain tissue, which was not possible, because of decomposition. After 4 days in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, the brain tissue was too degraded for detailed analysis. So these remain theories, possibilities, medical speculation without proof. The inquiry also examined the role of guard Robert Harris, the 18-year-old who had started working for London Underground in August 1974, just 6 months before the crash. Young, inexperienced, and as the official report would note, negligent. The inquiry's findings were damning. Quote, Guard Harris, in addition to being young and inexperienced, which he could not help, displayed himself as idle and undisciplined. Apart from being late for duty, he went to the rear cab shortly after leaving Old Street to look for a newspaper, and still had not returned to the guard's position by the time the collision occurred. He clearly paid no attention to the running of the train, and only became aware that something was amiss when he saw the station lights at Moorgate less than a second before the head of the train entered the sand drag. But the inquiry concluded, quote, even if he had been paying particular attention to the running of the train, I do not believe he could have been expected to realize that anything was wrong until the last car entered the crossover, by which time the front of the train was halfway along the platform, and an emergency brake application could not have prevented the accident. In other words, Harris was negligent, but his negligence didn't cause the crash. By the time anyone could have known something was wrong, it was too late to stop. The train was already committed to disaster. It was a theory, unprovable, based on the rarest of neurological events. But it was the only theory that fit the facts. The only explanation that accounted for a conscious, physically healthy driver, with no suicidal intent, driving deliberately into a wall. The inquiry's final report was delivered in July 1976, 17 months after the crash. But before that, before the official report, there was an inquest, held between April 14th and 18th, 1975. The jury heard all the evidence, all the witness testimony, all the technical analysis. They returned a verdict of accidental death on all victims, including Leslie Newson. Not suicide, not homicide, accidental death. On March 19, 2000, mourners attended a memorial service at St. Paul's Cathedral. Representatives of the London Fire Brigade, City of London Police, the ambulance service, medical services, and Leslie Newson's widow, Margaret, with her grieving family. Think about that. The widow of the man many blamed for the disaster, sitting in St. Paul's Cathedral, surrounded by families of the victims, some of whom believed her husband had deliberately killed their loved ones. The courage that required, the dignity. Chief Fire Officer Joseph Milner paid tribute to his crews. Quote, My 1,000 selfless heroes. 1,000 firefighters who descended into hell, who worked in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, who cut bodies from metal, who held hands with dying passengers, who emerged traumatized and went back down. Many would never fully recover. PTSD wasn't well understood in 1975. Trauma wasn't treated. You were expected to cope, to move on. But some never could. Frank, a firefighter whose full name wasn't recorded in the official accounts, later wrote, quote, "The sights, smells, and carnage I will never be able to forget, but I, along with others, will always be proud to say that I played a small part in a major rescue and recovery incident." Gallantry awards were given. Margaret Haig of the London Ambulance Service was made a member of the Order of the British Empire. Her citation read, "For gallantry." Station Officer Christopher Wood from Barbican Fire Station, and Richard Mark, Twiggy, Furlong from Shoreditch Fire Station, were each commended by the Chief Officer for their actions. Both men were subsequently awarded the British Empire Medal for Gallantry. They later attended number 10 Downing Street as Man of the Year attendees. Lead investigator Lieutenant Colonel Ian McNaughton presented the findings. The conclusion. Quote, "We find no mechanical failure, no signaling error, no track defect. The train's safety systems were functioning correctly. The dead man's handle was operational. The brakes were working. The crash was caused by driver error. But we cannot determine, with any certainty, why Mr. Newson failed to brake. We find no evidence of suicide, no evidence of medical incapacity that could be definitively diagnosed. We are left with the possibility, unsatisfactory as it is, that Mr. Newson experienced a transient neurological event that prevented him from recognizing the need to stop. Or, and we must be honest about this, we simply do not know." The report concluded, quote, "The cause of this accident lay entirely in the behavior of motorman Newson during the final minute before the accident occurred. But it did not suggest what that particular behavior might have been. Suicide, considered but ruled out. Alcohol consumption, considered but deemed unlikely and non-contributory. Simple daydreaming." McNaughton concluded that as the train went over the scissor crossing before the platform, it would have brought the driver to his senses. And Newson would have realized his circumstances before the train hit the wall, would have thrown his hands up in front of his face in a reflex action. But he didn't. The X-rays proved he didn't. It was an unsatisfying conclusion. No clear answer, no definitive cause, just uncertainty. But that uncertainty, that terrifying gap in understanding, would force a revolution in rail safety. Because British Rail suddenly realized something horrifying. Their entire safety system was based on assumptions. Assumption 1, that drivers would remain conscious, or lose consciousness in a way that released the dead man's handle. Assumption 2, that conscious drivers would follow their training. Assumption 3, that human psychology was predictable. Moorgate proved all three assumptions wrong. A conscious driver, holding the dead man's handle, could, for reasons medical science couldn't explain, fail to stop. And if that could happen once, it could happen again. The changes came gradually, but they came. First, automatic train protection systems. If Moorgate had been equipped with ATP, the train would have been automatically stopped before entering the overrun tunnel. The system used transponders on the track, communicating with receivers on the train. If a train passed a signal at danger, or exceeded speed limits, or approached a terminus without braking, ATP would override the driver and apply emergency brakes. It removed human judgment from critical safety decisions. Second, terminus protection systems. At terminal stations like Moorgate, additional safety measures were installed. Mechanical train stops that physically prevented trains from entering overrun tunnels at speed. Graduated warning systems that alerted drivers with increasing urgency as they approached the end of the line. Redundant detection that ensured multiple failures would be required before a crash could occur. Third, driver monitoring systems. More sophisticated than the dead man's handle. Systems that required positive actions, not just maintained pressure. Alertness devices that demanded regular responses, proving the driver wasn't just physically present, but mentally engaged. These changes were expensive. They required retrofitting thousands of trains, modifying hundreds of stations. British Rail initially resisted. Cost concerns, operational disruption, skepticism that such an event would ever occur again. But the families of the 43 victims, they campaigned. They wrote letters, met with officials, testified at hearings. Margaret Newson, Leslie's widow, became an unexpected advocate. She'd lost her husband, been subjected to speculation about his mental state, his competence, his intentions. But she knew, better than anyone, that Moorgate wasn't about one man's failure. It was about a system that couldn't prevent the unthinkable. Quote from her 1980 interview. "They keep asking me if Leslie was suicidal, if he was depressed, if there were signs, and I keep telling him, no, there weren't. Because he wasn't. He didn't deliberately kill those people. Something happened. Something medical. Something nobody understood. And the real question isn't why Leslie didn't stop. The real question is why the train could reach that wall in the first place. Why there was no safety system to stop it when he couldn't. That's what should have prevented this. That's what should have saved all those people." By 1980, 5 years after Moorgate, ATP systems were being rolled out across London Underground. By 1990, most major underground rail systems globally had similar protections. The cost was billions. But the alternative, another Moorgate, was unacceptable. Today, you can ride the Northern Line through Moorgate. The station has been completely rebuilt, modern, clean, safe. The overrun tunnel where 43 people died, sealed, converted to other use. The platforms, extended, with automatic safety systems that would stop a runaway train. There's a memorial plaque near the entrance. Black granite, simple text. Quote, "In memory of the 43 people who lost their lives in the Moorgate tube crash, 28 February 1975, may they rest in peace." 43 names below. Most passengers pass it without stopping, without reading. They're rushing, catching trains, going about their lives. Which is as it should be. The memorial doesn't exist to make people stop. It exists to remind those with responsibility. Rail executives, safety engineers, regulators. That human behavior can't be fully predicted, that assumptions kill. That safety systems must account for the incomprehensible. Because on February 28, 1975, every assumption British Rail held about driver behavior, about consciousness, about the predictability of human psychology, collapsed in a tunnel under the City of London. Leslie Newson's hand never left the dead man's handle. His eyes stayed open. He was conscious at impact. And nobody not the medical examiners, not the neurologists, not the investigators. Nobody could explain why. Which meant the unthinkable was real. The impossible had happened. And if it happened once, without explanation, without warning, without any way to predict or prevent through driver selection or training, then the only solution was engineering. Automatic systems that didn't trust human judgment. That assumed, correctly, that humans could fail in ways nobody anticipated. Robert Harris, the man who'd watched from the platform, gave a final interview in 2005, 30 years after Moorgate. He was asked if he still thought about it. Quote, "Every day, every time I take the tube, I think about it. I think about how random it was, how I wasn't on that train, how other people were, good people, people with families, with plans, with futures, all gone, because, and this is what haunts me, because nobody knows why, there's no reason, no explanation, just, it happened, and that's terrifying, because it means the world isn't as predictable as we want to believe, it isn't as safe, bad things happen, for no reason, to people who don't deserve it, and you can't protect yourself, you just live and hope." That's the legacy of Moorgate. Not just the engineering changes, not just the safety systems, but the knowledge, the uncomfortable truth, that humans can fail catastrophically, for reasons beyond medical science's ability to explain. That consciousness doesn't guarantee competence. That training and experience don't prevent every disaster. That sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, a person's brain simply stops, or changes, or experiences something we can't understand. And if that person is controlling a train carrying 300 people, the results are catastrophic. So we build systems, redundancies, backups, automations. We design for the unthinkable. We engineer against the impossible. Because Moorgate taught us, in the most brutal way possible, that impossible is just a word. That the unthinkable happens. And that 43 lives is far too high a price to pay for assumptions. The Northern Line still runs through Moorgate. Trains still arrive, discharge passengers, reverse direction. But now, ATP systems monitor every movement, automatic train stops prevent overruns, safety systems layered upon safety systems. All because of one morning, one train, one driver whose brain experienced something medical science still can't fully explain. 43 people died to teach that lesson. 43 people whose morning commute became their final journey. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They forced a revolution in rail safety, proved that human judgment alone isn't enough, demanded engineering solutions to human limitations. But for their families, for the survivors, for the emergency workers who spent 5 days cutting bodies from wreckage, the question remains: why? Why did Leslie Newson's hand stay on that handle? Why did his eyes stay open? Why didn't he stop? And the answer, the honest, terrifying, unsatisfying answer: we don't know. We'll never know. And that uncertainty, that gap in human understanding, is why we can never fully trust humans with the ultimate responsibility for life and death decisions. Why we need automatic systems, engineering safeguards, mechanical backups. Because sometimes, for reasons beyond explanation, the human brain fails. And when it does, in a tunnel, at 40 miles per hour, headed for a brick wall, The price is 43 lives. And a lesson written in blood, metal, and unanswerable questions. Moorgate Station. February 28, 1975. 8:46 a.m. The crash that proved humans can't be trusted with trains. Not because they're incompetent, but because sometimes, without warning, without explanation, without any way to predict or prevent, they just don't stop.